was young, I went to buy a new pair of shoes. I had the benefit of looking at an X-ray of my feet to see if the shoes fitted comfortably. The fact that that isn't done anymore was at least partly due to the work of Alice Stewart, who, in a series of publications in the BMJ, hammered home the fact that even small doses of exposure to X-rays could have consequences, particularly childhood leukemia, for fetuses who'd been exposed to X-rays in the womb. This was a relatively small effect statistically, so it needed a very careful and painstaking and long study to achieve it. It was also, by the way, fought against the establishment.
She had enormous energy. She had a physical robustness that was just utterly daunting. I mean, she'd plunge into a lake in northern Wales when everybody else was taking refuge in their hotel room from the cold. She was charming. She was wonderful company. I loved being with her.
John, you worked with Alice.
Yes, I did, for a short while in the 1970s.
What kind of person was she?
Quite remarkable. Full of energy, enthusiasm, bright ideas. Most exciting character to be anywhere near.
Tell me about her upbringing.
Yes, it is interesting actually. Both her parents were doctors, which was unusual in the 19th century. Both these people had a very highly developed social conscience, which rubbed off on Alice.
When she got to Cambridge, there were only 4 women in a student body of 300 studying natural sciences, and she went into this cavernous lecture theatre and she wanted to sit down, but the men moved to the end of each row of seats and she was forced down, and as she walked down there was a thumping of fists on desks with every step she took. This became enormously important to Alice. It went deep with her, and I think in her subsequent scientific life, whenever there was accusations that her science was in some way ersatz or lacking, I think she took it to be a form of sexual discrimination.
I think it was just at the end of the war that she came to Oxford. And the idea was to look at the practical applications of medicine rather than just the clinical picture. And she took over a study on child health. And that was what turned into the Oxford Survey of Childhood Cancers.
Leukemia is a rare disease, and it had been on the increase from the 1930s. So there was an increase, and people just didn't know what was causing it, and she had to come up with a way to investigate it.
Her genius was to devise a questionnaire that was inclusive enough to actually bring in the answer to this. I mean, it was a needle in a haystack kind of search, but she asked questions about exposure to infection, inoculation, dogs, cats, hens, bus exhaust, colored sweets, tinned fruits, and had you had an X-ray.
It was quite breathtakingly adventurous. I mean, when I tell you that every single medical officer of health in the country and every local authority was approached and persuaded to take part, you'll see that this was really quite an ambitious thing, and she was doing it really through her own personal energy and persuasive abilities.
Alice carried out this tremendous investigation for £1,000. It was a very small MRC grant, and it was her own tremendous enthusiasm for the subject and excitement that made her traverse the country. Nobody else could have done it, really.
When the result leapt out at her, as it did actually with the first 35 questionnaires, it was just so obvious that it had been the fetal X-rays that were linked with doubling the risk of a childhood cancer. She had no thought that radiation would be the culprit. So here she was suddenly plunged into this very controversial field. The official line on radiation was that large dose, of course, was understood to be dangerous. But the thought was that the smaller the dose, the more you decrease the dose, the less the danger became, until there was a threshold beneath which radiation was not dangerous. And here was Alice coming along saying that a fraction of the dose, which was claimed to be safe, was lethal.
What was the initial reaction to the 1958 paper in the BMJ?
They doubted it. It was viewed with scepticism, and why not? Doctors are supposed to protect people, not to take lives. The amount of lives being lost were quite small. Alice said it was about 1 per week. But I think there was an initial interest in it, and people thought this is good, and then, according to Alice, the temperature changed.
We have to understand this was a very revolutionary discovery. I mean, even she was shocked by the findings. She had no expectation that radiation at this small a dose would be this dangerous.
Alice's 1958 findings had the intellectual Geiger counter passed over them by Court Brown and Richard Doll, and indeed Austin Bradford Hill in a paper in 1960, which forms the crux, really, of Alice's career in epidemiology, and also some of her feelings that perhaps her lack of advancement was due to sex discrimination.
The paper was certainly crucial because these were people with a good reputation and they'd done a very systematic, careful analysis. And they were men. However, we were talking about a very different kind of study, one which was massively too small to reproduce Alice's results.
It wasn't a very good study, those were his words to me, but it ended her access to funding in the UK.
What was her relationship with Richard Dole?
It was a tremendously interesting one. They were both left-wing. Alice said that she couldn't imagine how any doctor practicing in the 1930s could vote Conservative. Most people in public health medicine were left. Richard was a communist and more to the left.
They had, in a way, a close relationship. There were a lot of similarities between them.
And Richard would say that he was on very friendly terms with Alice and they got on well for much of their time.
And then, when she discovered how dangerous radiation really was, her career nosedived, plummeted into obscurity. His skyrocketed to fame with the discovery of the lung cancer smoking link. He was knighted. He has a building named after him. There's a center at Oxford named after him. The contrast could hardly be more poignant.
There was a parting of the intellectual waves, and when Richard became Regius Professor in 1969, it was in his power, I think, to have given Alice the position of professor, which in many ways she deserved.
It was something she said about, I don't know why we couldn't have been working together all those years. We'd have done so much more if we'd been able to work together. And I don't know either. I don't know if it's a tale of rivalry or sexism or simple scientific disagreement that accounted for his animosity, but I do know that it was there.
Alice went along as reader here, underfunded, cold-shouldered by the university, and Alice was really becoming anonymous in her own subject. People really hoped that she'd rather go away, but she didn't. So I think it's a tribute to Alice that she kept epidemiology going in Oxford with little funding and very little credit.
The Court-Brown-Dahl study assured that she never again got major funding in England, but without, on a threadbare budget, she nevertheless charged forward and extended her database. It existed in 23,000 manila envelopes. Actually, it's on the cover of our book. This is the Oxford survey. You can't really see it there, but she was very proud of it, so she liked this. She ran the numbers, extended the database for the next 20 years until she found, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that if you x-ray a pregnant woman, you double the chance of a childhood cancer. It wasn't until the 1970s that the FDA recommended against fetal x-raying, and doctors went right on x-raying into the 80s. So, as she says, it helps in this field to be long-lived.
I mean, we sometimes like to think that science is independent of personalities. It's just a discovery of the truth, and if X doesn't find it one day, Y will find it the next day. Would you say that's true of Alice's work?
I don't think it's true as a general proposition. It's certainly not true of Alice's work. She was someone who had ideas. The ideas, I have to say, were a bit revolutionary. She would turn things upside down.
And it is important to remember that Alice changed medical practice, and for most physicians, that's an incredible thing. Her observations were brought into safety standards, radiological protection safety standards. So in that way, Alice has made an imperishable contribution to a new science.
It was a favorite saying of Alice's that truth is the daughter of time. She had a feeling that her work would be proved true. She wasn't sure that she would live to see it. She did live to see some of it.
Alice had a wonderful description of epidemiology. She used the analogy of astronomy. She said it's like you're looking at a constellation of stars in the sky, of people, and you have your hands tied behind your back. You can't touch anything, you can just observe what's happening.